With all this Dragon Age the Veilguard news coming out, I've been thinking about it almost exclusively. 1, Varric looks incredible, as always. 2, Harding also looks incredible, but she definitely got a hairline reduction. That is not the same girlie that I met in Inquisition. 3, this is a thought that I'm sure most people had, but a mage killer means that I'm going to romance him with a mage rook, obviously. Number 4, Davrin is the hottest Dragon Age character to date, but then number 5 is that Tosh is the hottest Dragon Age character to date. Which brings me to this image. Your romance options for the game. And then these 2 pieces of information. 1, that you are able to romance anyone regardless of your in-game sex chosen, and 2, they can romance each other. And I've been having a lot of thoughts about romance options in video games, and not just in Dragon Age, but I've also been playing a lot of Stardew Valley. And Stardew Valley famously has NPCs that are romanceable and available to anyone. And there are 2 reactions in me whenever this option is presented to me. 1, as a queer person, I'm extremely elated to not only be able to play as whatever I want, but romance whoever I want in whatever setting. Instead of having to do what I did in Tomodachi life when I was 14 and I made Edward Elric a girl so I could marry him, because obviously I'm the boy in the relationship. Obviously. And the other side of me is a little bit disappointed. And there's a lot of context as to why, so let's jump into queer romance in video games. Not that I need any qualifiers or anything, but as someone who's been professionally, casually, and competitively queer my whole life, representation in media is extremely important to me, whether I'm a part of the marginalized group being represented or not. Representation of any kind is vital and crucial to everything, whether it plays an important part of the story where a character is dealing with the struggles of identity, or if it's just a fact about the character similar to their age. Identity is not just represented through characters, but through stories and input from the creator or other people's lived experiences, which is why we can tell when things are a little bit ham-fisted, right? We can tell when a creator isn't drawing from something that they know about, when it's marketing or when it's to push their narrative through other means. That's why I've had the thought about queer romance be so prevalent in my head recently, primarily through AAA titles. And I must make this distinction before I move forward. I'm not focusing on queer romance between NPCs or player characters that are pre-established, like Zagreus and Hades being bisexual, Clementine in the Walking Dead series being bisexual, or Samantha in Gone Home being a lesbian. I'm talking about you, the player, creating your avatar, whether you choose to create yourself as closely as you possibly can from real life into the game, or if you're like me, where you create OCs to play the game through. So you can determine your sexuality, your gender, your story, your actions. And the topic of queer characters in media is something I do want to talk about, but that has to be another video, otherwise this video is going to be 45 to an hour long, which it probably already is. Primarily, my point is the idea of inclusivity and the importance of representation. I don't want anyone to confuse this with the idea that I think that labels are the most pressing part of someone's queerness or a character's story. Rather, I want to focus on the idea of sexualities playing in tandem with their story, because despite it being able to be a piece of background information for a character, if they are romance options with a developed romance subplot, their sexuality is important. And I want to talk about these games in particular: Stardew Valley, Fire Emblem Three Houses, Dragon Age Inquisition, and Dragon Age the Veilguard. And I'll come back to that asterisk, so let's start with Stardew Valley is one of my favorite games of all time. I first played it with my closest friend when I was in college, and I romanced Harvey on my first playthrough. I didn't really know the cast of characters available to me, and I did have a soft spot for nerds with mustaches and being inept at socializing, not that that has really changed at all since I was in college. After doing my research, I find out you can romance anyone in the game and no one will bat an eye, except for maybe George. And I was so excited to romance the hot artist. So my second playthrough I romanced Leah, and I'm still on my second farm, but I want to romance Maru next. Admittedly, it's because Fiona Sangster made a video on Maru, and I've watched it maybe 3 times since it came out, and it made me develop a soft spot for her. I also have a weakness for neurodivergent and neurodivergent coded characters, but that is also another topic for another video. What I realized through a lot of the romance cutscenes in Stardew Valley is that they're very similar regardless of your player sex, which is a good thing. It is important to have games and stories where same-sex relationships are not only normal, but accepted. And we can see through some dialogue options that there are some instances in second guessing, but one character stands out more than the rest: Alex. Alex, the stereotypical peaked in high school jock of the town, has a much more in-depth same-sex. That is very difficult to say. has a much more in-depth same-sex romance storyline. Why did I write it like that? In-depth Dude! Let me try again. Alex, the stereotypical peaked in high school jock of the town, has a much more in-depth same-sex romance storyline than if you were to romance him with the AFAB farmer. Nailed it. First try. He has to overcome some internalized homophobia and external homophobia from the aforementioned George, his grandfather. In his 10-heart cutscene, Alex confesses that he felt drawn to the farmer, but said he can't have these feelings for another guy. He has something that I think is very important to show, which is overcoming societal standards and thoughts that have been predisposed to him through friends and family. I also want to mention that up until recently, Stardew Valley was created and worked on by one person, Concerned Ape, or Eric Baroni, but I'm going to call him Concerned Ape because I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I don't know if it's Barone or Baroni. Regardless, I don't want anyone to think that I'm trying to criticize him or say that it was a bad idea for him to make everyone romanceable to anyone. I think it's a very good thing, especially in the context of Stardew Valley and games like it. Firstly, because within the context of Stardew Valley, not everyone is out. At least we don't know that, and it's not really important. Which is secondarily, romance isn't a driving force for the character or the story of whoever you're romancing. You can go the whole game without romancing anyone in the town. Unlike in games with Fire Emblem, you don't just wake up one day with a spouse through getting enough hearts. It is an active choice that the player makes, and they don't romance each other, so whatever headcanon you have for a character, it can remain. Is the character bi-pan? Well, in whatever storyline you follow, it's up to you. For all intents and purposes, when you romance Leah as an AFAB farmer, she's exclusively into women, as far as you know, because her ex that shows up, I don't remember their name, is it Kay? Is it Kai? I don't remember. It's been so long since I've seen that cutscene. If you romance Alex as the AMAB farmer, you can make a case as to whether he's bisexual or gay. Do I think that Haley has a very good shot at being a compat lesbian? Absolutely, but I am a very, very big advocate for sticking to what is canon. Whether my beliefs for a canonically queer character, the canon is more important. Mechanically, everyone is bisexual, but these mechanics can give you suspension of disbelief, right? It's important to have bi-pan representation, and I'm a big advocate for someone who is bi-pan myself. I love the fact that there are bisexual characters. It makes me feel seen, and it's totally cool for it to be where it starts and stops. In Stardew Valley, everyone is available to you, so does that really make everyone canonically bisexual, or does it just open up the floor to headcanon? I think it's important to have some things defined, story-wise and character-wise. Do these characters have to have a label? Of course not, just like people. If you are queer and you want to label it as just that, absolutely fine. Or if you don't want to have an identity labeled to you, more power to you, I support that 100%. But it is much more meaningful to romance options and gives depth to character if it's a part of them, even in the smallest way imaginable. My side tangent goes into a game that seems to have the opposite problem. The entirely uncontroversial Fire Emblem. 3 houses. Oh, this is embarrassing. Especially if you know me. I spent years of my life in debates on Twitter with people about Fire Emblem, which I should put in my how many days app for sobriety with how many days it's been since I've engaged actively with Twitter discourse. And it's going to go down right to 0 because I love engaging in Twitter discourse. It's kind of my favorite thing on the planet. And that kind of brings me to something else. I know that it kind of goes against my predetermined player character, that was my little asterisk, rule to talk about Fire Emblem 3 houses and many of the Fire Emblem games in general, all of them, but I think that it fits Baelith as a silenced protagonist because you make a lot of choices for them. They have enough story that it kind of goes against my point of you choosing, but I really want to talk about the romance options, okay? So just like give me a chance here. In Stardew Valley, you have 12 romance options, all available to you from the get-go. And it works differently in Fire Emblem. You reach different ranks with characters. You start, I think, at C, and then it goes up to S. And in order to get to a romantic relationship, you need to reach S rank with someone. Now, an S rank doesn't necessitate a romantic relationship. For that purpose, I'm going to be excluding Gilbert and Alois from this romance campaign that I'm doing here, because their endings with Baelith are not necessarily romantic. And in Fire Emblem 3 Houses, you get 37 romance options. That is if I counted correctly. And there are only 8 available to you as either AFAB or AMAB Bailiff. Again, not including Gilbert or Alois, and if you do want to count those as romantic options, then you have 10. Another thing is that I am not including S support endgames that are not including your Bailiff. Petra and Dorothea definitely have an ending that says that Dorothea is the one that Petra loved the most, but okay, again, another topic another time. And indisputably, these characters are bi-pansexual. What is the difference, you might be asking? Why do the romance options in Stardew Valley have open-endedness where the ones in Fire Emblem are definitive? And it's simply because the existence of exclusive romances and what I want to talk about a little bit later. The fact that there are other romance options for these characters. It isn't like Awakening where the romance between characters has a huge impact on the story because romance happens after all of the major story beats. So there are characters that have ambiguously queer endings, and there are characters like Ingrid and Flayn where they have no endings that even hint at queerness being present in their canon at all. That gives a hard line within the story regarding sexuality, that things are indisputable for some characters. While you can debate the sex-exclusive romance options who do have queer-coded endings with other characters, these characters here are indisputably bi-pansexual. You can have headcanons, and I support those, but that does not take away from canonical queerness. Whereas within Stardew Valley, I'm not going into people's comments who say that they view Abigail as a lesbian or Sebastian as gay and be like, well, they're bisexual mechanically, so you can't say that. And this is not to say that Fire Emblem is a better representation for the community than Stardew Valley or anything else that I'm going to be talking about. Fire Emblem has a lot of weird things going on in the canon, and it's not a pariah for inclusivity. It has no exclusive gay or lesbian characters, and sometimes it feels like characters that should have been gay or lesbian were forced into being bi-pan due to Fire Emblem being a notoriously anti-queer series up until recently, despite having characters that are clearly queer-coded. Regardless, I didn't get into Twitter debates about Fire Emblem because I was defending the game. I got blocked by several people for saying that I think it's weird that you can romance your relatives. So it's like a double-edged sword here. Really, what I'm trying to do is set up the stage to talk about Dragon Age. I cannot overstate this enough. I love Dragon Age. My best friend and I of almost 10 years met on Twitter because we saw each other talking about Dragon Age. She was helping me move recently, and we paused to watch the gameplay reveal trailer for the Veilguard. I send her every piece of news and every meme that I come across. It's an integral part of several aspects of my life. I started with Inquisition. I was watching one of my closest friends who lived with me at the time play Skyrim, and then a lot of people that I was following online was playing Inquisition. So I really wanted to get into this high fantasy realm. And did I ever get into it? Oh my god. I played through Inquisition 3 times to romance different people and take different routes. I made Caden to romance Dorian, I made Aveen to romance Iron Bull and then also Punch Solus specifically, and I made Shale to romance Blackwall, but I hated Blackwall so much that I ended up romancing Josephine instead. Aveen and Shale are still characters that I actively draw and write to this day. I lost the files and I'm really mad about it, but I actually wrote about a textbook's worth of information on the new necromancy system that I made in the 10 years that it took from Inquisition's release to the Veilguard now. And it's kind of crazy, and I'm probably not going to write it down for a really long time because it lives up here, and that's where it's going to remain living. Something that I really enjoyed about Inquisition was the romance options. The fact that there wasn't just canonically queer characters, but ones that were specifically labeled as bi-pan. They were much more in depth, so this section of this video will naturally be longer, but I promise that this is the least amount that I could say while trying to make my point. That, and to the same person who was having to make Edward Elric a girl in Tomodachi Life to marry him, playing this game in the same year, that was incredible. And BioWare is not the perfect company, and while I will get into some of my personal gripes with the company, I will not be getting into the bigger issues that they've been facing. What I will do is I will leave some links in the description so you can read up on them yourself, and if you want to discuss them in the comments, I am a fan of criticizing big companies that do bad things to their workers. Regardless, I am here to talk about queerness in the game's romanceable options, starting with, and really only, Inquisition. I do want to do another video about Origins and Dragon Age 2, but I want to replay Origins because I gave up at some point and then I just watched a playthrough for it, and I rushed the ending of 2 because my computer kept crashing whenever I was at a certain part in the lowlands. So I don't really, like, I skipped a lot of important story beats. But we're gonna be talking about Inquisition. There are 8 romance options, 4 of them being queer. Dorian is gay, Sera is a lesbian, and Iron Bull and Josephine are bisexual or pansexual. I've heard them been referred to as both. I think that Iron Bull is canonically supposed to be pansexual. I'm not sure about Josephine though. And I do want to do a series where I break down these 4 individually because I think that they are extremely well written, except for you. Love interests, arguably even more so than their non-queer counterparts. Again, not including you. You have some issues that I want to talk about that I don't have enough time to talk about right now. Anyways, Solus stans, please do not come at me. I know that y'all are a fierce crowd, and that his romance has a lot of nuance that I will never understand because I will probably never romance him. I'm not a fan of his, but I respect the Solus girlies. I respect them, or the Solus boys. I don't care. I respect Solus stans. As someone who loves insufferable characters, I get it. I don't get it. What I enjoy the most, I think, is that they're representative of their identities in a core way, and some of them have very important stories that I think need to be told. It is a necessity, as I previously mentioned, that queer people not only see themselves in characters, but also see their stories being told. Personally, I started playing Inquisition first because of the mention of a trans-masculine character, Krem. Not only because people were talking about it, because there are so many things that people talk about that I have no desire to get into. I do not care for Baldur's Gate. I don't care. But I started off not caring about Dragon Age until they were like, oh, the first trans character is in there, and I was like, I need to see this. Krem has a very similar background to me, where he would pretend to shave with his father growing up, and his identity as a queer person tainted his relationship with some members of his family. Krem was also written by a non-binary author named Trick Weeks, so I feel even more connected to that character as a non-binary person myself. These things are really important to see, not only within media, but to see that there are people like you, like me, like anyone who you may be seeing on the street suffering, they are able to get their stories out. Most of the time, historically in Dragon Age, queerness is not that big of a deal, or at least that's what people might assume. In forums and discussion posts that I found online, people often praise how pro-queer Dragon Age is. There's a prompt in the game where you can thematically craft the narrative of homophobia in whichever land your Inquisitor hails from by saying, is that a problem here? Suggesting that it's common in other places, but not where you're from. Is homosexuality a sin in Thedas? Not really, no. There's no religious backing that people in Dragon Age can point to like people here in the real world can through their holy texts, regardless of whether or not it says anything actually about homophobia and homosexuality and queerness and whatever. The interpretations that we have made in our holy texts suggest that it's not okay to be queer, whereas in Dragon Age that's not an option. There's no religious significance that I can find that points to queerness being a sin. Homophobia and transphobia stems from societal standards, or wanting to keep up appearances, or wanting to get out of displacement or unfortunate circumstances. These things are mirrored in real life, with one very tragic one being gay conversion therapy. Again, not getting into the whole history, but Dorian, my personal favorite Dragon Age character, has been the victim of abuse by his family for being queer. In a personal side quest, Dorian reveals to the player that after telling his father that he was gay and not willing to marry a woman for appearances, his father used blood magic on him to try and change his sexuality, akin to conversion therapy. Dorian's father, after years of not seeing Dorian and after losing his prestigious title and status, apologizes to Dorian and said that he regrets what he did to him. A lot of queer people who are romancing Dorian or doing these side quests or watching the clips or whatever could find a lot of relatability in this aspect of him. Family members finding out, horrible reactions, the idea that some sort of abuse will fix their sexualities only for those family members to years later, after being disconnected from their children, try to reconcile. I want to start this section off by saying that I didn't do a whole lot of research into the person who wrote Sera before I wrote this section, which was a mistake on my part. Because as I was doing research for other characters who are queer in the game, it looked like they were written by mostly queer people. So I assumed the same for Sera, but I was wrong. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm trying to praise the guy who wrote her, because I don't think that she is a well-written character. But I do think that there are some aspects of her that are well constructed, and they might be unintentional because it might not be wrapped up in queer history or with the idea of her queerness in mind, but some lesbians might see themselves in Sera because a lot of history for queer people is wrapped up in rebellion. And sapphics might find her relatable because she is very slow to trust. And that could be related to her queerness. I don't think it is, because there are other aspects of her story that I'm not going to get into here that gives her history as to why she doesn't trust people. But sapphics might, and myself included, might find her a little bit more relatable because she's slow to open up. And when sapphics open up about their sexuality, especially to other AFABs who are not queer or not as accepting as they think they are, they get told that they haven't found the right man yet, or not to develop a crush on me, like that kind of stuff. And as someone who went through that, it made me keep my sexuality to myself for a very long time. I was not able to open up in a school or public setting until I was in my 20s. And I'm still in my 20s, but I've known that I'm queer since I was 11 years old. That's why I think Sera does have some relatability to her. With that, she is one of the only characters you can't get a gift for. At some point during romance storylines in Dragon Age, you need to get your romance your romantic interest, a gift to show that you're serious about them. And for Sera, you go around and you ask everyone what they would get her as a gift if they were in your position. And when you open up to Sera about that, she gets elated because you went around and told everyone that you're partners. She finds it funny that you told Solus because Solus notoriously doesn't like Sera, and Vivienne is nobility, and Sera likes to stick it to nobility, so she definitely got a bigger kick out of the idea that you, as the champion of this group, is coming out as saying, like, yeah, I'm dating the outcast, instead of, oh my god, she told everyone that we're lovers. But some lesbians might think that is a bigger token of gratitude and a sign of commitment over a gift that someone could get them. Sera has a lot of walls and prejudices against people that she takes out in sometimes childish ways, and her romance as a result definitely has way bigger ups and downs than I think other people's in the game. And it's definitely because she wasn't written by a lesbian, but not even by a woman. Like, she wasn't even written by a woman. She was written by a man. And I want to talk about later on in another video queer people being written by non-queer writers. But to keep it brief here, queer voices should be the ones telling queer stories. Wanting to write a character outside of a marginalized group that you're not a part of is cool, but you need to get resources and inspiration from real queer people or other marginalized people, because otherwise you're going to make a bad story. You're going to make a character that falls flat. You're not going to want to tell the story that you're wanting to tell if you do have well-intended meanings behind telling that person's story. Moving on to Iron Bull. He's a man from a different cultural background than we are used to, and his relationships as a result tend to be physical before emotional. Iron Bull is the first Qunari that you can romance in Dragon Age, so there's a lot about Qunari history and culture that I want to talk about, but that's also going to have to be for another video, unfortunately. But what I will do is, if you're curious, like you haven't played Inquisition or you don't actually know a whole lot about Qunari because you didn't do any of the Qunari stuff in previous games or with Iron Bull, I will link down some resources to Qunari cultural lore and stuff like that, because it's very, very interesting. We don't really ever get to learn a lot about sexuality through Iron Bull, because a lot of Iron Bull's story is the inverse of what you would expect with Dragon Age romances, where you start sleeping with him before you develop a romantic relationship, or like even an emotional, intimate relationship with this man. That's really all it is. Like, that's all that his storyline is that it never gets into his sexuality, and that's fine. That's okay, I guess. I wanted to jump in and add that I think that Iron Bull has like the second best romantic subplot after Dorian. And so that's not where it ends in terms of his like depth. But that's where it stops with the topic of his sexuality, because I didn't want to get into it, because I really do want to talk about the Qunari and their lore in a separate video. But the Qunari have such a different way of thinking about sex and a different societal set of standards than we do, that like I couldn't get into all the intricate points of the Qunari lore. But to sum it up, the Qunari don't use sex as romantic gestures. They frown upon using sex as romantic gestures. They even frown upon using sex for procreation. Sex is like merely there for pleasure. And so it makes sense for the first Qunari romance option to start with sex, and then it evolves into a romantic relationship where you assumedly don't have sex as much. But I don't know. Like, I don't know how, like, that doesn't have as much relevancy to the topic that I'm trying to discuss here, which is why I jump right into Josephine. So right after I disappear in like a second, I'm gonna start talking about Josephine. It's gonna seem kind of out of nowhere, but I wanted to give that context as to why I stopped talking about it. Okay, bye. With Josephine, the other bi-pan character in the series, she also doesn't really have anything going for her, like, in terms of her sexuality. Like, another bisexual character in the game who was romanceable in previous games, Liliana, she, like, tells you that Josephine is innocent in love, and that's kind of all that we get. Like, we don't really have any depth to these bi-pansexual characters. And it's not like these characters don't have love lives outside of the Inquisitor or even the Circle itself. Sera, if you don't romance her, starts dating a dwarf outside of the romance pool, but Josephine and Blackwall, who is another romance candidate for you, do have feelings for each other. They just don't enact them. And I'm certain that there's more examples, but outside romances, in my opinion, for the context of this video, are fine, as it doesn't take away from the existing identities within the group that there is. One of my biggest gripes with BioWare is that they flushed out everything regarding sexuality, including giving Cassandra the option to be undeniably straight, which is ridiculous. Look at this woman. You're telling me that she's not sapphic. That's crazy. That's insane to me. Bi-pansexuality kind of takes a backseat, which brings me to my final talking point, Dragon Age the Veilguard. Now, cat's out of the bag, this game isn't out yet. And it doesn't even have a date stamped on it, so I can't criticize it. But my fears fall in the loss of these connections and storytelling. It's taking the part of Stardew Valley that I mentioned, where sexuality plays no part in character story, while also taking the part of Fire Emblem Three Houses where queerness is a background point, making it almost sterilized, in what I suspect to be happening for the romance aspect of the Veilguard. Also, the last game gave us that almost nothing burger of bi-pansexual importance doesn't give me hope that romance subplots are going to have anything of substantial meaning. We could have characters struggling with self-identity if BioWare wanted to remove outside stereotypes. Characters struggling with compulsory heterosexuality, identity issues, something that gives that idea of bi-pansexuality a little bit more depth to it. It makes a little bit more sense. So, well, then maybe we can have what Stardew Valley has, and we can do that approach, right? Where sexuality only matters in the context of the romantic subplot. The character is comfortable with their identity, or maybe someone has similar realizations that Alex has. But that doesn't matter when they have background romances. Does that make sense? The depth of these characters takes a drastic hit. And I mean, seriously, you can't tell me that Emmerich doesn't look like he has some killer trauma related to blood magic rituals. This one's similar to what Dorian underwent, seeing as they both are mages and necromancers and have ties to that kind of magic that gave way to Dragon Age conversion therapy. That's not a funny joke, and it's not even a joke. That's what it is that there is conversion therapy. Emmerich doesn't have to be gay in order to have that, but there has to be some kind of consistency with homophobia, otherwise this world falls apart. Keeping with the idea of Qunari that I talked about earlier and sexuality, having a Qunari character who is asexual would be something not out of the ordinary with the history that this game has provided us with. Sex repulsed or scared of it because of the way that they were raised can add a layer of depth to a character and the struggles of identity within a queer space and the topic of romance. Because asexuals, they do have queer identities separate from their asexuality. You know what I mean? Like, asexuals struggle within the queer community. I don't believe that you can be aphobic, but I do believe that asexuals struggle in their community. I am on like 18 fucking apho block lists. So I do want to have asexual characters that struggle within the queer space being represented because it is important. Again, this is all speculation. I can't say what is and what isn't in the game because it's not out yet. And I definitely would love to talk about it in the future when it comes out. And I can see these storylines for myself. Who knows, maybe this will be the best cast of romanceable NPCs that I will ever see in my life. I have no idea. One can absolutely find themselves in an entirely queer circle, but the inclusion of outsiders and a vast open world format of a world that we've already been exposed to would lead one to believe that there would be the same viewpoints and societal standards and history and whatever. So we lose any sort of depth that we would have gotten by BioWare saying, well, queer people love our game, let's give them what they want. And I'm not trying to say that it's bad to have more inclusion, the opposite. Actually, I'd be thrilled if there were more queer characters in this cast than in the previous game, which, you know, half of them were. I just didn't talk about the queer characters in Dragon Age who weren't romanceable in Inquisition because there are queer characters outside of your romance options, which the people in your romance pool should be romancing, in my opinion. But that's just me. That's just me. I think I'm the only person who has a gripe with this, and that's okay. As long as you're hearing me out, that's all that I care about. I'm merely just trying to suggest that I would like more substance. I would like to have more nuanced and meaningful queer characters in stories where their queerness is relevant. Having a ragtag team of queers where their sexuality means nothing to the story or the player character is fun and cool, and I'm for it 100%. But that's just the thing, is that their sexuality is secondary to the story. They're not actively being romanced or put into situations where they have to, like, think about or ask or face tough questions, decisions, choices, or situations that come with the experience of being in a queer romantic relationship. Not saying that there aren't games like that. If Found is one of my favorite games of all time, and the main character is a trans girl who struggles with her identity and her relationships and her family, and that's very important. It's very important to see, and I want more of those stories. But you're playing a narrative experience instead of being a part of a world. All this to say, was Inquisition perfect in its romance? No, but none of these games are, or will be. I don't know. I don't know about the veilguard, but I do like to, as a queer person, see more of what I experience put into characters by queer authors. Queer characters feel so much more alive and authentic when they are written to face issues regarding their sexuality or gender identities, especially when the author is channeling their experiences into them. It's why Krem is such a memorable character to me, because its author knows what it's like to struggle as a queer person in the world. And I'm perfectly content with having everyone be available to anyone. But that's the thing, is that if you're AFAB and you want a romance Dorian, you can do that. You just have to make a male inquisitor. Having limitations doesn't make a game less inclusive or less progressive. It can actually be the opposite. Having no representation through the passiveness of, well, everyone is bisexual and homophobic stereotypes don't exist is sterile. Especially when you create a world where there was or is stereotypes. I think it's crucial for queers to get their flowers 100%, and they can have it however they so desire. You want to romance Dorothea as an AFAB or AMAB bailiff? By all means. You want to romance Alex as an AMAB farmer? Sure thing. You're AMAB and you want to romance Sera? There's an option for that, and it's called fantasy, and it's play an AFAB inquisitor. Let her story be told with her queer identity. Even though it's not great, don't take away the fact that she is a lesbian. And that's what I talked about earlier, where you can create your own canon for the characters in Stardew Valley, because it's a mechanic. The player can believe whatever they want about whoever it is that they are romancing. It can create queer identities where other people may not see them. And if it's being used as a marketing point, it feels hollow, like none of these characters actually have an identity. Thanks for watching.